when you say, the powers that be, when you say, my brother's keeper, when you say, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, when you say, the salt of the earth, fight the good fight, the apple of his eye, a man after his own heart, the writing on the wall, you are quoting one man. He was a quiet Tudor scholar with sharp eyes and a steady hand who believed an English plough-boy should be able to read the Bible. For that, the church of his time tied him to a stake in a foreign country, strangled him, and burned his body. 3 years later, his king made the book he had died for legal. 80 years after that, the King James Bible printed his English almost word for word, and nobody knows his name. Some people change the world, and the world never learns their name. This is without whom. His name was William Tyndale. He was born about 1494 in a quiet corner of Gloucestershire, in the west of England, into a country where it was a serious crime to read the Bible in your own language. The only legal Bible was in Latin, and the only people allowed to read it were the priests. He was a brilliant boy. He was sent to Oxford. He was reading the new languages of European scholarship in his teens. He read Greek. He read Hebrew. By the time he had finished his studies at Oxford and at Cambridge, he could move between Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, French, Spanish, and German almost without thinking. The world of his time was a world that printed in Greek and Hebrew the original words of the Bible. He had read them. In about 1521, he came home to Gloucestershire as a tutor to the children of a Gloucestershire family. He read his Greek New Testament at the dinner table. He preached small sermons in the village church. And he began to compare what was actually written in the New Testament with what the local priests were telling people on Sundays. The two did not match. One evening, at that dinner table, a learned priest told him, in front of the family, that we would be better off without God's laws than without the Pope's. Tyndale set down his cup and answered him in a sentence that has come down through 500 years. He said, I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spare my life ere many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plough in England to know more of the Scriptures than you do. He went to London. He went to ask the Bishop of London, the highest church authority in the country, to give him permission and a place to translate the New Testament into English. The bishop refused. Tyndale wrote later that he found there was no room in the bishop's palace to translate the New Testament. He found there was no room for it in all of England. So in 1524, he did the only thing he could do. He left England. He never came back. He went to the German cities of the Rhine, to the printing presses of the new Protestant Reformation, and he set to work. He intended to give his country what its priests had refused. He worked in Hamburg. He worked in Wittenberg. He worked in Cologne, where Catholic agents broke up his printing in the middle of the run. He gathered his pages in the night and rode south up the Rhine to a free city of the empire, called Worms, where the Reformation already held the streets. There, in 1526, a young Rhineland printer ran off the first complete printed New Testament in the English language. He had it printed small enough to hide in the lining of a coat, small enough to slip flat between the folded bolts of cloth, small enough to slide inside an empty wine cask. He printed thousands of copies, and he began to ship them home. English merchants who quietly loved the work smuggled the books home in their cargoes. Bales of woolen cloth, wine casks with watertight false bottoms, sacks of flour, crates of hides. Within months, English farmers and English apprentices were reading the New Testament for the first time in the language they actually spoke. The Bishop of London ordered the books seized and burned in public in front of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He even bought up entire shipments of the books on the continent in order to throw them on the fire. Tyndale took the bishop's money, used it to pay off his debts, and printed a second, better edition. By the early 1530s, he was living quietly upstairs in the English merchant's house in Antwerp, in what is now Belgium. He had taught himself Hebrew. He had become, in that small upstairs room, the first man to translate the books of the Old Testament directly from their original Hebrew into the English language. Most of what English speakers think of as the rhythm of the Bible was being written, line by line, in that room. In the spring of 1535, a smooth, charming young Englishman arrived in Antwerp and made friends with him. He spent weeks gaining Tyndale's trust. One afternoon, he asked Tyndale to lend him a little money for dinner. The two of them walked out together down a narrow Antwerp alley. Imperial guards were waiting at the corner. Tyndale was arrested on the spot. He was taken to a great stone castle outside Brussels. He was thrown into its cells. He was kept there for almost 18 months. He was not allowed out. He was not allowed visitors he trusted. We know what he was doing in that cell because one of his letters from it survives. He wrote to his jailers in Latin. He asked for a warmer cap. He asked for a warmer coat because the evenings were bitterly cold. He asked for a candle to read by. And above all, he asked them for his Hebrew Bible and his Hebrew grammar and his Hebrew dictionary. He was still translating. In the summer of 1536, the court of the Holy Roman Emperor put him on trial for heresy. He had translated every line they convicted him for from the original Greek and Hebrew. He refused to take the words back. He was sentenced to death. On the 6th of October, 1536, he was tied to a wooden stake in a public square in the small town that held the castle. Out of mercy, the hangman strangled him first with a length of rope. Then a torch was put to the dry wood under his feet. According to a contemporary chronicler, his last words, spoken aloud through the strangling, were a prayer. He said, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." 3 years later, the King of England did open his eyes. In 1539, King Henry signed an order that placed an authorized English Bible in every parish church in the country. The book was based almost entirely on the work of another English translator, who had used Tyndale's own pages as the foundation. The king's order was, in everything but its title, the book the king had hunted Tyndale across Europe to suppress. In 1611, when the King James Bible was finally printed, it borrowed more than 8 out of every 10 lines of its New Testament word for word from the man who had been burned for writing them. For the next 400 years, when an English speaker prayed, or married, or buried someone they loved, they used his sentences. They did not know. He gave the English language its quiet, steady, weather-beaten music, the rhythm of an English wedding, the rhythm of an English funeral, the rhythm of half the lines that English-speaking writers, from Shakespeare onward, would ever write. The boy that drives the plough did learn to read it. So did everyone after him. The world you live in was built by people you have never heard of. And now, you know one more name. William Tyndale. Like and subscribe and stick around, because the textbooks left a lot out. Thanks for watching.